everyone can be here. Delighted everyone can be here. I'd like to welcome people to this roundtable, the first of two that are going to be organized on the writing aspect of things by the Society for Socialist Studies. This one has also been endorsed by Faculty for Palestine. This roundtable has been long in the making. It was actually postponed once because of the COVID crisis in 2020, and then it was to have been held during the Society for Socialist Studies conference in 2021, which was postponed because of our decision in solidarity with the Black Canadian Studies Association not to participate in Congress in 2021. I'm delighted that all our participants are able to be here and we're able to have this standalone event, which is fantastic. My name is Paul Kellogg from Athabasca University, and I'll be have the pleasure of chairing this roundtable. It's important to acknowledge the lands upon which we are. Because it's a Zoom session, we are in many places. Toronto, where I am at the moment, I'll do two. I'll do Toronto. In Toronto, where I'm currently situated, and some of the rest of us are, we're on land which has been for thousands of years the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. We're also using the Zoom platform, and I want to acknowledge that the Zoom Corporation is headquartered in San Jose, California, which is the land of the Ohlone and the Muwakama Ohlone community who trace their ancestry through San Jose. Now, let me introduce the speakers, and to do that, I will share my screen like that. That's the topic that we're having, and the speakers are going to be speaking about their experiences of writing topics relevant to the long struggle of the Palestinian people. The first two speakers will be dealing with the book Israel, Palestine, and the Politics of Race, Exploring Identity and Power in a Global Context. There's two people, Yasmin Abu-Laban from the Department of Political Studies at University of Alberta, and Abigail B. Bakken, Department of Social Justice Education at OISE, University of Toronto. They are the co-authors of this important book. Next, we will have Ghada Agil from the Department of Political Science, University of Alberta, co-editor of the Women's Voice from Gaza series, the covers of two of which books you'll see there on your screen, A White Lie and Light the Road of Freedom. Then we'll hear some words from Justin Potter, author of the novel Siege Breakers, and with another beautiful and evocative cover. Justin Potter is from the Faculty of Environmental Studies, York University. Next, we'll hear from Gregory Shupak, Media Studies, University of Guelph, author of The Wrong Story, Palestine, Israel, and the Media. And finally, we will hear from Suzanne Berliner-Weiss, an independent researcher, author of Holocaust to Resistance, My Journey. That's going to be our journey as we listen to these interesting and important contributions from the authors. The format's going to be very simple. Authors will introduce their books for about 10 minutes. A little bit longer for the first one, which is co-authored, so 6 minutes to each of the two co-authors. We'll then have some time for discussion, and there's the little wonderful way you can raise your hand here under reactions. And at the end, authors will have a chance to respond to points raised and to each other. Megan Aiken will be looking after the chat, and by the way, Megan, thank you for all the great publicity and the Eventbrite organizing. That's been fantastic. There's one other person I want to acknowledge who couldn't be here, Elaine Coburn, who was the organizer of the conference, the Social Studies Conference. She sends her regret she can't be here, but she did a whole lot of work in the background in the run-up to the 2021 conference, and this panel is a result of that work. Those are my introductions. Without further ado, I will pass it to Yasmin and Abby.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'd really like to extend our thanks to the Society for Socialist Studies, to Paul Kellogg, Megan Aiken, and also Elaine Coburn for their work in organizing this session and making it all possible today. So a couple of days ago on Twitter, there was a colleague who asked academics how their writing was going, and to respond by way of a GIF. Or I guess if you're really into peanut butter, you might say by way of a GIF. Anyway, the animated responses that came in were really, really funny. There were images of people banging their heads. There were images of people ripping up paper or developing weird kind of tics and twitches. But when we consider writing Palestine, it really goes beyond the common difficulties even the best and most seasoned writers can encounter. And that's because when we consider writing Palestine, it's really at heart about the hostile terrain one encounters in daring to take on the topic. Now, Abby and I have written separately on lots of issues, but much of our work on Israel-Palestine, including our recent book, has been jointly written. And therefore, we're doing this joint presentation. And just by way of background, I'll note that Abby and I have been working, speaking, writing together on questions relating to Israel, Palestine, and power for close to 15 years. And so our 2020 book, Israel, Palestine, and the Politics of Race, is an outcome of that work. And in addition to that, we've also written several book chapters and journal articles, and we've given a lot of talks about our work in Canada, in the United States, in Europe, and also now online. So I guess when you go online, it's pretty much meaning the whole world. One of the things that stands out about this collaboration across all of these different venues we've engaged is that when we write or speak Palestine, we do something that we don't really do anywhere else. And the thing that we do is that we explicitly position ourselves as scholars with roots in two different cultural and diasporic experiences. So Jewish in the case of Abby, and Palestinian in my case. And because this is unusual for ourselves, we have frequently revisited why we do this. We've debated about doing it, debated its relevance. And this is because we're political scientists. The discipline that we're in has never been one that's been particularly prone towards stressing an author's background or positionality. Also, Abby and I don't like essentialism. We reject dogmatic essentialism. And we also don't draw attention to our identities in our other academic scholarship and publications. On top of all that, we're really aware of a very contextually specific danger in the context of writing Palestine. And that is that our particular identifications may serve to feed into a very problematic and very strange dynamic evident in many North American universities and other organizations. And this is the dynamic that holds that in order to have a so-called balance, a Palestinian speaker that's going to talk about the Middle East can only be heard alongside an Israeli speaker or at least a Jewish speaker. And this is an odd dynamic because the question of balance has never emerged with the same force when there's a Jewish or Israeli speaker who's discussing the Middle East without a Palestinian. So all of this is really telling us a lot about power dynamics and also the particularly fraught way in which discussions of Israel and Palestine frequently take place. And part of the very real difficulty has been that to raise questions that are critical of Israel's treatment of Palestinians is for some basically the same thing as expressing anti-Jewish racism or anti-Semitism. And in part, that's because Israeli politicians typically proclaim Israel as a Jewish state. Now, in fact, Zionism, understood in the way that we use it in the book, is a political movement that forwards an exclusive commitment to an ethnically defined Jewish state. So Zionism is not the same thing as Jewishness as an identity or Judaism as a theology or religion. Zionism as a political movement arose in the 19th century. It was a response to anti-Semitism in the context of Europe. Now, if we look at Palestinians, one thing that's clear is that they lack a state. And also, as one of the largest and oldest refugee groups in the world, they don't have the kind of institutional support as well as the capital, both material and cultural capital, to have their experiences made known. And these experiences are varied and include being in exile, under occupation, or a minority in the context of Israel. But more critically, the articulation of Palestinian experiences has really been suppressed, actively suppressed. And sometimes that's to such an extent that we actually can see very clearly the limits of free speech and academic freedom, even in liberal democratic contexts. And so as a consequence of all of this, for scholars, there really is no normalized conversation in the academy on Palestine in the way that we have a normalized conversation about the United States or about Canada. So coming back to why Abby and I have opted to do this positioning, it's really because we found that when we do this, essentially people express relief. Somehow our joint presence across sides of a purported divide somehow reassures people that a conflict is not about to erupt. And we felt that by highlighting our differences in identity, this allows perhaps some greater space, mental space, and reflective space to think about issues a little bit differently and begin to make space for a more normalized conversation about Israel and Palestine. The last thing I really want to stress is that the fact that Abby and I have been working together jointly for so many years, like I said, close to 15 years, that's longer than a lot of marriages last, right? And the fact that we've been able to do this for so long is really stemming from the reality that we have much more in common than we have difference. And that's important because it's our commonalities that account for the collaborative partnership. And it's our commonalities that really speak to the kind of paradigm that we use as political scientists who traverse disciplinary boundaries. And so what is this paradigm that we use? Well, our paradigm or our way of working is grounded in four things. The first is that we study power, which we understand to be both materially and ideologically grounded. The second thing is that we see value in the comparative study of politics and all states. A third is that we see value in both the multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary study of race, gender, class, and citizenship. And a fourth element is that we embrace the perspective of anti-racist feminism. And so in our joint work, we argue that attending to race, to racism and racialization is really critical for understanding politics relating to Israel, Palestine, both internally and also internationally. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Abby to talk more about this element of race that we want to highlight.
Thank you, Yasmin, and thank you, Paul and Megan and everyone who's here. So our commitment to address race as it relates to Israel-Palestine is grounded in consideration of political realities, where state structures, political actors, and civil societies are rendered knowable through such a framework. Israel needs to be understood as a state and analyzed as such in a world of states. This centrally requires addressing race, just as political scientists have increasingly done with regard to many other states across world regions. In the case of Israel, this further necessitates centering Palestinians and anti-Palestinian racism. Of course, it also means understanding anti-Jewish racism, as Israel, a state it claims to represent, the constructed category of the Jewish people. But we need to understand that racism operates in different ways, often hiding behind coded language. We need to be attuned to how racism targets Palestinians in specific ways and how this reverberates in discussions even outside of those who are looking at Israel-Palestine. As an Arab grouping with a large number of Muslims, Palestinians have encountered both anti-Arab and anti-Muslim racism. However, they are also victim to systemic anti-Palestinian racism. While the material and ideological aspects of racism, specifically regarding Palestine and Palestinians, are well documented, naming this reality has proven fraught. The continual suppression of Palestinian rights claims is entangled with complex codifications, which are commonly, and of course contentiously, based on appropriation of the suffering of the Jewish community facing anti-Semitism, here meaning anti-Jewish racism. So the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 is marked by a racial formation of its own, serving to transform Ashkenazi or European Jewish refugees and their descendants into settlers and citizens of a new state. This settlement process laid the basis for the survival and relative advancement of a dispossessed European Jewish population vis-a-vis other groups in the region, and hence a form of whitening in relation to power and privilege occurred. But significantly, the ascendance of a section of the Jewish population was also strongly skewed towards Ashkenazi or European Jews. Other Israeli Jewish populations, including Arab and North African Jews, the Mizrahim, have suffered from longstanding racial and ethnic discrimination relative to Ashkenazi Jews. At the same time, by the 1950s, the restrictive policies and responses to refugees, which expressed anti-Jewish and other forms of racism in Western states, gradually came to give way to more openness in an age of ostensible universal human rights, at least formally. So notably, Palestinian refugees continue to be left outside of these measures and continue to experience uniquely oppressive and racialized bordered exclusions. So while the Palestinian right of return has been recognized recurrently by the United Nations, this right is firmly denied in practice. Instead, Palestinians are marked as the quintessential quote unquote terrorists when it comes to international border security and surveillance. So in our text, Israel, Palestine, and the Politics of Race, we adopt a frame to focus on racism that we have learned from the late Charles Mills, and this is the notion of the racial contract. Charles passed away only very recently, and we owe a major tribute to him and to his work. In our ongoing work since the publication of the book, we've continued to adopt and to adapt our commitment to advancing a consistent politics of anti-racism that can render the Israel-Palestine reality knowable and therefore subject to meaningful and lasting transformation. Naming anti-Palestinian racism for what it is clashes with a narrative forwarded not only by the State of Israel, but by the advocates of the State of Israel, which insists on centering issues of race narrowly on questions of anti-Semitism. And this has also impacted politics as well as scholarship. For Palestinians, however, a focus on racism as a way to explain their experience is not recent. There are numerous instances in which race and racism have been invoked to discuss the situation of Palestinians in international bodies before and after the foundation of the State of Israel in 1948. At the same time, issues of anti-Semitism do demand attention, especially in light of the growth of far-right xenophobic groups in North America and Europe. And this is painfully exemplified, for example, in the armed shooting that killed 11 and injured 6 in the attack at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh in October of 2018, or on January 6, 2021, when the attack on the US Capitol included those wearing t-shirts with the logo Camp Auschwitz. These are only some of the events indicating in stark relief that the legacy of the Holocaust and the daily reminders of anti-Semitism are real and their present dangers. But these examples also indicate that anti-Semitism should not be trivialized, which is the effect when the term is weaponized to exploit Jewish suffering, while in reality serving as coded rationalization to ignore, silence, or discredit the legitimate human rights claims of Palestinians. So our argument is really very simple, that one racialized group cannot be emancipated through the violent racialization of another. And this is what we've tried to theorize in our book. Thank you.
Thank you very much. While I unmute. There we go. Thank you very much. That was a wonderful way to start the roundtable. I will now pass it over to Gada.
Well, thanks, Paul, and hello, everyone. And thanks for the Society of Socialist Studies, or for Socialist Studies, for organizing this roundtable on writing Palestine. It's really my pleasure to be here and join this platform with respected colleagues and scholars. In the next 10 minutes or so, I intend to talk about my latest publication, Women Series, or Women Voices from Gaza series, edited with, or co-edited with a colleague, my colleague Barbara Bell from Australia, and published by the University of Alberta Press. The volume, a collection of 7 stories, recounts life in Palestine prior and after its destruction, and narrated by 7 women who lived through those harsh experiences. The series itself is a response to all those forces that try to silence or mute Palestinian voices, and bypassing their core issues and demands for justice and for rights. However, before delving into this to explain about this volume, allow me to introduce myself in the way I see it. True, Paul has introduced me as Ghada Agil, the scholar, and the academic or the activist. And true, I am all of that. But above everything, I am a Badrasawi. This means that my ancestral roots goes to village called Bedaras, beautiful, magnificent, peaceful, that existed for hundreds of years in the southern meadows of Palestine. Today, this village is no more. It has been erased by Zionist militias in the course of 1948 Nakba, the catastrophe that destroyed the Palestinian community and turned its vibrant society into a problem. We become known as the Palestinian problem, and the catastrophe that displaced the majority of the Palestinian people and turned us into refugees, often described in academia as, Yasmin mentioned in a minute, as the oldest and largest refugee problem in the world. And despite this sheer size of the problem, it's rarely, or it's neglected in global politics. Although Bedaras is no more on world map and depopulated over the course of 70 years of settler colonialism, it still exists in the hearts of all Badrasawis. Collectively, we, the Badrasawis, the people of Bedaras, as well as the Yafawis, the people of Yafa, the Sawafiris, the people of Sawafir, and the Majdalawi, the people of Majdal, and the rest of the 550 villages and towns that have been depopulated in the war. We still carry our villages wherever we go, as our children and our children's children will do. The story of my lost village, and by extension homeland, was narrated to me, the generation who were born in the camps, decades after the destruction of Beit Daras. Our generation, or our grandparents and elders, told us the story straight from the heart, straight from the mouth, and straight to the heart. There was no books to tell or to read stories from. After all, people under occupation do not possess books or stories. That was prohibited in Gaza. And books used to be smuggled so that we could feel the touch of a book or a story. My grandmother narrated the Palestinian story with passion and love. To this moment, I can repeat those tales and stories with the same facial expressions and the body movements while passing them on to my children. The stories shaped my life and planted the seeds of my oral history research project that I will touch on in a minute. My grandmother narrative was not meta or abstract, but embodied and physical, living the story as a reality, not as a myth. As listeners, we responded in kind when her voice creaked or broke, so too did our hearts. Thus embodied, she narrated both the personal and the political. The ingredients of her life fill the pot of our national story, national history, that politicians opted to neglect and most of the time to deform. One spoon of happy, 2 spoons of sad. That's the reason every time I tell a story, it is an act of honor to the courage of my grandparents and to the generation of the Nakba who taught me, us, the history of the lost homeland, and at the same time, an act of love and steadfastness, as well as resistance in the memory of Biddaras and the brave men and women who fell defending it. Women Voices from Gaza, the oral history narrative, offer a detailed and vivid picture of the places and people of past and present of a people. It traces Gaza's history and by extension Palestinian history, a rich tapestry woven of many strands. It asserts the centrality of narrative of Palestinians in reclaiming and contextualizing Palestinian history and aims to reorient the story of Palestine by restoring it to the original narrator, the Palestinian people. Collectively, those stories stand as a counter-account to mainstream narrative, hoping that such a small part of individual accounts can convey a clear and bold picture of the communal one, a representation of the collective Palestinian struggle for rights and freedom, inviting readers in at both moral and epistemological level and opening new venues for conversation which break the intellectual apartheid imposed in Palestine. Intentionally or unwittingly, as Dr. Ramzi Baroud states in the foreword of The Light Road of Freedom, the second in this series of Women Voices from Gaza, traditional history to a large extent has failed Palestinian people, assigning them the role of dislocated and nomadic people without caring about ethical and political implication of such representation or in fact misrepresentation. Discounting and stereotyping Palestinian in such way has presented them as submissive collective to be wiped out by those more powerful. Traditional history, Dr. Baroud proceeds in the foreword, described Palestinian as lesser being, an obstacle in the face of peace, progress, and civilization, or altogether even contended whether Palestinian even existed as a people in the first place. We all remember the infamous words of Golda Meir when she said, I don't remember something called Palestinian or such thing that called Palestinian. Women Voices from Gaza challenges this misrepresentation and this colonial myth of Palestine as an arid space that was turned into paradise thanks to the ingenuity of the Zionist European settler, and still the words for Dr. Baroud. This series restores some of the dignity to the untold story of all Palestinians. It also attempts to expose the bias of the mainstream media in representing Palestinians, whom it often describes as either hapless, powerless, aggressors, rarely people with agency, never freedom fighter, but always violent and terrorist. And on this issue of misrepresentation, I want to end my talk by sharing with you an observation that I had from Gaza. I visited Gaza this past summer and saw the destruction, the devastations, the agonies, the loss, and the pain. But at the same time, I also witnessed the hope and the resilience, talking with people from all generations. This past summer, the boxes of chocolate and the tea were distributed in the streets of the camps and the Diwans celebrating the achievements of Gaza high school students who occupied the majority of the top 10 places in all Palestine, despite the brutal Israeli attack that ripped through the ravaged and besieged strip just weeks before the start of the exams. These young people are not the helpless or hopeless Palestinian who are often presented to the world through grim statistics or chronicles of event. These young people were successfully molding the concept of hope into a revolutionary strategy, a revolutionary tool in the battle for dignity and freedom. They were equipped now with a story of brutality and ugly violence by occupying power and of a life lived in response. With this powerful tool in their hands, like each preceding generation, they would send the story into the world for all who had ears to listen. As I was packing my bags to return to Canada, I said a tearful goodbye to my family. Rafah crossing was a short drive away, and on the other side would be a journey into the pain of separation from the homeland. As I said goodbye, my family tried to lighten the load of some smiles and humor, naturally, but ironically. The ones staying in Gaza were bringing the laughter, playing in the old prayer of the Passover, Siddur. Their words echoed in my ears. Next year in Beit Daras, inshallah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gada. That was very, very moving. Thank you. I now pass it to our next author, Justin Poder. There we go.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. It's such an honor to be on this panel with all of you, and it's so nice to yeah. I'm just thrilled to be in this company. So my genre for this, I mean, I write a lot about Palestine and have been for, I don't know, 20 years or whatever, but my genre today, and what I'm talking about today, is actually a thriller novel. And I wrote it because I'm actually a huge fan of thriller novels, and I've always written fiction. I've always, read a lot of fiction, and I'm a big fan of thriller and war novels and conflict. I read about war. I'm an anti-war activist. I read about war. As part of that, and also on my leisure time. It seems to be that all that I think about is that. So for me, it wasn't like a big stretch. The thriller is kind of my genre here. And, when I think about writing, today's a writing day, a writing discussion. When I think about writing, it's all genre, really, right? I mean, political science writing is genre writing too. So, you always choose your genre and you try to write according to those conventions. And the thing is, with the thriller genre or the military genre, or the detective genre for the most part, where you have some heroic characters doing some heroic deeds, it's in pop culture, it's always in a kind of a racist pop culture, it's gonna be the enemies of the of the establishment that are cast as the bad guys, the villains. So I love that genre, but I don't love that part of it. And I thought I wanted to write a story that I wanted to see, a story where Palestinians were the heroes, where Palestinians were doing the heroic deeds. And it's something you see in real life. If you follow it closely, you see that there are people like that. And whenever I would talk to people about the idea, Palestinians or people who follow, Palestine, and I say, it's about a bunch of action heroes, breaking the siege on Gaza, people would say, well, there are people like that. So it's not a stretch. It's not far-fetched. And the thing that I do in the book is that it's I try to make sure that everything that these heroes do is sort of humanly possible, and which is one of the rules of thriller writing, is that it has to be barely humanly possible. So it's humanly possible, and a lot of the stuff was done. So it's just sort of like things that people have done, but it's like my heroes do all of them instead of just one of them. And the people who spoke so far, I'm glad to be following them, in the sense that the idea of who's allowed to write about this, right? Like that was like one of the questions that people had for me, is like, you're not Palestinian, are you? And it would be like, no, I'm not Palestinian, but I read thrillers, I read about heroes, I watch heroes, and I had to write this about my heroes. Like that's kind of what it comes down to. Whenever I write anything, it's out of a sense of frustration, but it's also a thriller like this is also out of a sense of celebration. And I really wanted to, share my enthusiasm for the kind of heroism that I've been watching unfold over these decades. It's the other thing that Yasmin and Abby mentioned, was the idea of balance, and how we don't, the idea that everything has to be balanced. And it's funny, because my book, I don't know, maybe it was the easy way out, but I did balance. I did have a balance. I have Palestinian protagonist, but I also have an Israeli, double agent who's secretly working for the Palestinians all along, and some Americans there too. So I did some kind of balance. I wanted to have that perspective. When you're talking about a colonial situation, it is hard to have that without the colonizer, right? And I suppose I could have just had the Israelis be the villains, the way that according to the genre convention, but I don't, that's not how I understand even the situation in Palestine. And I couldn't really present it that way, even if I, maybe even if I tried. And so, thrillers, like, I feel like I'm part of this panel nonetheless, even though it is a genre thriller book, because what we're writing about is colonialism. The other thing, though, that I was trying to do in this book is I'm also trying to write about a utopia. There's a science fiction writer that I really like, he's on the left. His name is Kim Stanley Robinson. And he's written, in an interview, he said something like, anybody can write a dystopia these days. All you have to do is put together a bunch of newspaper headlines. But writing a utopia is hard. And so, and you have to sort of in this world, you have to sort of imagine something, maybe in some detail, before you can do it. So I just wanted to imagine the most minimalist way that the siege on Gaza could potentially be lifted. And that's kind of like, that was like the driving question. Like, let's imagine how this could conceivably happen. What kinds of little changes would have to happen in the world for this to happen? And that was like where I was going. I knew that that was what was going to happen at the end of the book. And so I had to figure out how to get there. The last thing about this genre, there's an essay that I read a little while ago called The Swerve. The author is someone named Nia Frome, and they were talking about pop culture, and they were talking about like this theme that you see in a lot of pop culture. Game of Thrones is probably the most stark example. Game of Thrones pun. The Hunger Games is another one. The Watchmen is another one. She says, or they say, there's a common trope in media where it's revealed, most often near the end of the story, that trying too hard to do good makes you evil. Game of Thrones, HBO's Watchmen, The Hunger Games, and many other shows, movies, and games all have endings that seem to come out of nowhere, as if they're imposed from without rather than obeying the story's inner logic. any pop culture artifact is compelling to the extent that it taps into our real desire for change, justice, virtue, freedom, resolution, etc. But it can never go all the way down this road. It can't consummate this desire because that would be too threatening to the reigning social order. And that for me was fascinating. And that was also a motivation for me, which is, I'm not going to do that. I don't have to do that. I don't have to do that swerve. I can actually get you all the way to the end, where Palestine is free, at least in this book. So that's what I wanted to do. In a way, fiction is like one of the safer ways to threaten the social order, which is maybe why I gravitated to it. So I think I'll stop there. Again, thank you all for letting me be part of this.
Justin, thank you so much. That's fantastic. I now have an alternative to Raymond Chandler to read. This is fantastic. Thank you very much. I'm going to pass the microphone to Greg Shupak now.
Thank you very much, Paul, and to all of the co-panelists. I'm thrilled to be here and humbled to be here with you. I also appreciate the work that Megan and Paul put into this for a long time. I just want to express my gratitude to them and to anyone else who helped put this event together. So I'll start by talking a little bit about the I guess writing Palestine in terms of the reception of the book that I've written and my experiences associated with that, and how I think that who I am might have shaped that. And then after that, I'll move on to giving people a bit of a sense as to what the book is actually about. So my general sense is that, of course, a person's identity shapes how people read their work or don't read it, as the case may be. And for someone who, like me, is not Palestinian or Arab, and who is not Jewish or Israeli, that I think is taken one of two ways. One, there's to my advantage a kind of sense that maybe I think among some that makes me or people like me some kind of neutral observer, which I think is totally untrue, because I don't think that there is any such thing, and I certainly don't consider myself that. But people who are sort of overly deterministic about identity, I think, are sometimes inclined to say, oh, a person who writes about this as a Palestinian or an Arab more broadly, or Jewish or Israeli, is necessarily based on those categories, biased in some irredeemable way. The other response is that, because similar to what Justin was saying, because I don't have to invoke cliche, skin in the game, I have nothing to add and possibly have no right to speak on the subject. And I can sort of say that my conclusion to that is that I'll leave it for others to make that assessment. And if they want to read the book or anything else that I write, then that's great. And if they don't, then I respect that, and that's fine as well. So that's kind of, I think, how who I am has maybe shaped the reception, or at times lack thereof, depending on how you want to look at it, of the book. As far as sort of the negative aspects that seemingly inevitably one encounters while writing about Palestine, is, or at least writing about Palestine from a pro-Palestinian perspective, is the backlash, which from the outset I would say I think has been far more muted against me than many others who have addressed the subject. And I have no doubt whatsoever that that's related to my whiteness and quite likely also to maleness as well. You know, a couple of instances where I've received pushback is in, you know, an effort by Zionist students to cancel a talk I was doing at University of Western Ontario a couple of years ago, I guess in 2018, and smearing me. The students were, you know, smearing me online and insinuating that I that having me speak on the campus during Holocaust Remembrance Week is somehow disrespectful to the Holocaust. And, you know, the students came and they tried to ask gotcha questions in an effort to trap me into saying something anti-Semitic, which of course doesn't work because I don't think anti-Semitic things and thus don't say them. And then, yeah, last year is a similar experience where we had an online panel and somebody tagged my employer in a tweet in which they falsely and baselessly called me anti-Semitic. Tagging my employer was somewhat unnerving because I'm an untenured sessional lecturer. None of this comes as a surprise because I've been following Zionist attacks on people who write material critical of Israel for years. And I've been part of activist groups that have received that kind of backlash for more than a decade and a half, whatever it is, a long time. And so that isn't something that I could even say I've learned, because I sort of know that that's what happens when you address this subject. And like I said, I'm lucky because many others, including I'm sure people on this panel, have received much more intense hatred and pushback than I did. The one thing that maybe I did learn is that it would of course be a mistake to underestimate the extent to which Israel's supporters will go to defend against any, intellectual resistance to colonialism and apartheid. One also shouldn't underestimate the strength of the Palestine solidarity movement and the size and courage of our networks. So, this has helped me in the Twitter verse when it came to some of the the smears that were directed against me. And neither the university that I work for nor the department that invited me to Western caved to these slanders that were leveled against me. I think that a very different outcome could have well happened not too many years ago. And although horrible outcomes do take place currently, I think pro-Palestine organizing has managed to at least partially change the climate. And again, not entirely, of course. We've seen this case just recently with Dr. David Miller in the UK. But so we clearly have a lot of work to do. But I'm just trying to emphasize that while there's plenty to feel discouraged about on the Palestinian issue, any examples of people successfully getting around the intellectual disciplinarians of Zionism and imperialism should also be kept in mind, just so to make sure that we don't allow despair to defeat us. So that's my reflection on the experience of writing Palestine. I'll say a little bit now about my book. And so my book revolves around three of what I see as the predominant narratives in media coverage of Palestine, and my account of why each of these is fatally flawed. So the first of these is the misleading perspective that both sides, quote unquote, both sides, Palestinians and Israelis, are victims of and at fault for ongoing violence to a comparable extent. The second paradigm that I look at is ubiquitous in Western media, and that is that Palestine and Israel can be seen as a so-called conflict between extremists and moderates, as it is sometimes framed. So this would be the view that, well, the problem is that Hamas has too much power. They're extremists, and sometimes it's even extended to Israel, where the problem is Likud or the settler movement, rather than the reality, which is the entire Zionist project. So the third chapter that I have looks at news media outlets. This is the third major narrative that I consider. News media outlets framing Palestine, Israel coverage in terms of Israel's so-called right to defend itself against Palestinians. So, I try to emphasize that people consume media critically often enough. And there are other paradigms that exist, and there are cracks in these conceptual walls. But I emphasize that these are recurring tropes spread across multiple media outlets that have been published for years. So these are persistent, widespread distortions, and in my book, I attempt to take them apart and see how they operate and why they're flawed. I know I'm very short on time, so I'll just quickly say that I also do my best to try to answer why media coverage is so pro-Israel. And I locate that in the larger political economy of mainstream news media, which is very much embedded with capitalism and imperialism, and Israel's value to Western societies is largely as an outpost for global capitalism, as a sort of major tech hub, as a weapons depot and manufacturer, and as a mercenary force for US-led capitalism's need to snuff out opposition wherever it pops up around the world, from the Cold War to the present. So I won't go on any further, but that's, I hope, gives people some sense of what my work attempts to address.
Thank you so much, Greg. You're giving me lots of new reading that I have to read now, so I'm going to get to this book very shortly. The final speaker on the roundtable will be Suzanne Weiss. Suzanne, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Israel has designated 6 organizations supporting Palestinian freedom as so-called terrorists. This is strikingly similar to what we face in Canada, where expressions of support for Palestine are routinely branded as so-called anti-Jewish. How do we respond to this? Well, here's how I first saw it. My initial engagement as an activist in the liberation struggle for Palestine was in November 2005. I received a request from Abby Backen, my Jewish friend and prominent Toronto socialist, for letters protesting a visit to Toronto by Ariel Sharon, Prime Minister of Israel at the time. I wrote a letter stating that Sharon was notorious worldwide for his involvement in repeated mass killings of Palestinian civilians. Regarding the massacre of the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps in Lebanon, in which more than 2,000 Palestinians were murdered, Israel's own investigation commission found Sharon to be indirectly responsible. I opposed his admission to Canada as a Jew who has suffered the Nazi Holocaust, the Nazi crimes. I had long identified with the Palestinians as victims of barbarous injustice. Here was a chance to stand with their cause and mine for human rights. After signing my name, I paused and added the words Holocaust survivor. It was strange that I would say this after many decades of silence. I had not thought of myself as a Holocaust survivor because I did not experience Hitler's concentration camps. In France, where I was born, the government of Vichy had welcomed the German Nazis and assisted in their killing of Jews. That's how my mother had landed in Auschwitz and where she died. I was hidden as a Jewish child in the community of Auvergne. When I was 9 years old, I was adopted by a Jewish couple in the United States. I rarely shared the story of my beginnings with my acquaintances and friends, but a new movement was growing in Toronto, which was sparked by Israel's vindictive treatment of Palestinians. On learning of my Holocaust background, Abby proposed that I speak to an evening rally at Metro Hall Square. I agreed. Hundreds would be there. I had never before spoken to a large crowd. The appeal for the Toronto protests called Israel an apartheid state, drawing a parallel with South Africa. That brought back vivid memories of my work in the 1960s defending the victims of South African apartheid, including Nelson Mandela, once branded as a terrorist. Many years later, discussing apartheid, Mandela drew the parallel with Palestine, adding, "We know too well that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians." I saw Mandela's comparison as an affirmation of hope and confidence. The Palestinians and Israel conflict would indeed be resolved peacefully, as had happened a decade earlier in the case of South African apartheid. On November 14th, I stood on the platform, looked out into the evening cold, and saw signs reading, "War criminals not welcome here." The audience was young and vigorous, chanting in response to the speakers. It was an emotional moment just to be there. What a joy to link my aspirations with the cause of Palestinian freedom. It was strange and a little frightening to reveal myself to a large public audience. I felt particularly vulnerable referring to my mother and her death in Auschwitz. Speaking of her evoked feelings in me that were, to my surprise, still raw and painful. And although I had often spoken to Arabs of my passion for their freedom, never before had I met Palestinians. I was proud to publicly ally with the Palestinian people. I feel the suffering of the Palestinian people with a distinct sharpness because in certain respects, it calls to mind what I, my family, my community endured at the hand of Hitlerism. That's what I said at the rally. Hitler's Holocaust is unique in history. Nothing is similar to it. Still, many Israeli techniques, the expulsions, the ghettoization, the pervasive checkpoints, have a disquieting resemblance to Nazi methods. To oppose Sharon is not anti-Jewish, I stressed. Sharon and his government aggressive policies in the Middle East run against the interest of Jewish Israelis and Palestinians alike, all of whom have a stake in a peaceful and united Middle East. We have gathered here as a united resistance of everyone who defends justice and human dignity against Sharon, I continued. A united resistance can, like the anti-Nazi resistance of my childhood, win out against the oppressors. I was thrust into a new role as a public spokesperson, one who had to learn to speak succinctly and clearly. Following the rally, I joined the coalition against Israeli apartheid and became part of a new global campaign launched by Palestinians for the right of those forcibly exiled to return to their land, for equal rights within Israel, for ending the occupation and colonization of Palestinian lands. The campaign became known as BDS because it used methods of boycott, divestment, and sanctions pioneered by the South African fighters for a peaceful solution to apartheid in their country. I'm often asked, doesn't Israel represent all the Jews of the world? It's a question that hits me hard because so many people believe that lie. In fact, Israel represents a political program that is endorsed by the imperialists, such as the governments of the US, Canada, Britain, France, and others, to divide the peoples of the Middle East. These supporters of Israel apartheid are campaigning to stifle the voice of Palestine today. They accuse us of being anti-Jewish or being anti-Semitic because we point to Israel's occupation and brutality against the Palestinians. But Israel cannot hide its crimes from the world's peoples. We demand that Israel adhere to international held laws of human dignity. People of conscience must reject apartheid in Israel just as clearly and forcefully as we reject white supremacy in Canada. I'm active in Independent Jewish Voices. IJV leads us against the rise of white supremacy currents in Canada, whose ideology is founded on hatred of the Indigenous, Blacks, Jews, and Muslims. We uphold the Jewish tradition, the value of universalism. Principles of freedom and justice apply equally to all peoples, especially to Palestinians oppressed in our name. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you.
Thank you very much. That was a wonderful way to bring this portion of the roundtable to a conclusion. Now, as people gather their thoughts to ask a question or make a comment, I wanted to make one. As I was listening to all the authors speak, I wanted to thank you all collectively for the work that you have done to write these books, because it is extremely important in the school system to have books for the curriculum. And it's extremely important in the struggle to have books that can help us learn the lessons of the past and guide us in the future. It's a tremendous amount of work, and it is an important part of the struggle that we all face. So I just wanted to thank you for all the work that you have done in preparing our book table for the 2020s or whatever we're in right now. So I'll now take a look here and see if Zoom, if you go to the little thing at the bottom under reactions, you can find a way to raise your hand. See what happens when I do that? There, I just raised my hand. So I'm going to lower it and see if there's anyone else who wants to raise their hand, who has a thought, a question a comment for the speakers before I have a chance for the speakers to chat amongst themselves? I see one from a young man named John. I believe that's John Riddell. There we go.
Well, thank you, Paul. I think it would be interesting to write on how Canada came to be an opponent of Palestine in the Constitution of the State of Israel. And so this is a projection for a future session of the Writing Palestine project. And I have a personal involvement because my family was involved in this process through the agency of the United Nations. And in the course of the last year, I was contacted by somebody who knew something about this process and knew something about the role my family had played. And it turned out that actually this decision did not come easily in the foreign affairs establishment of Canada, that it was contested. That there was a very courageous woman who put forward the other side, that Canada should fight for justice for Palestine. So there must be documents on this. There must be a record in the archives, and I propose to take a little hike down to Ottawa as soon as that's possible and prepare a report for a future session of this series. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Do I see any other hands? People want to say, I see Suzanne's hand, but you just spoke, Suzanne.
Well, I would like to say that everybody who spoke on this panel, I want to thank them because they are part of the struggle and they are continuing, they're going to continue to be part of the struggle, especially in this issue of the governments and those who support Israeli-Palestine, who are trying to snuff out the voice of the Palestinians. So everyone who spoke on this panel contributed today to the struggle. And it's an acknowledgement to Israel's, what they're trying to do. What they're trying to do worldwide, and that is to snuff out the voice of Palestine. And you as writers can continue doing that. I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
While people are collecting their thoughts, I have one direct question for all the writers, which is, have you had any success in getting your books reviewed in the daily newspapers, in magazines and journals, etc.? Because I know that from the recent Censure U of T campaign that just happened, there was, well, it was a fantastically successful campaign, an interesting reluctance on the part of certain aspects of the mainstream media to give it the proper coverage it deserved. So I would be very interested to know about the press reception to the books that you have written. And if anyone would like to say a few words about it, Greg, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. So I just would say briefly that I got several reviews were written of my book, but they were all in independent media, typically either left-wing media and or media that focuses on the Middle East. So yeah, I did get some exposure that way, and they were all very generous and thoughtful, and I appreciate them immensely. However, yeah, certainly nothing in the mainstream media.
Others?
Yeah, me too. I mean, no coverage or, in fact, reflection or response from mainstream corporate media. But as Greg said, there has been some reviews of my first and second books in independent or left media. Although like the first book, Apartheid in Palestine, I thought that it's gonna bring conversation and I will get some calls for interviews or at least do some book reviews, but no, I haven't heard such thing.
Thank you, Gada. Others of the authors like to say a few words about that.
Yeah, I mean, I was taking on a very uphill. I knew what I was getting into, in the sense that it's like, I would say that the kind of the activist community or the pro-Palestine community that would be interested politically are not necessarily like, it's not full of Thriller fans. So like that Venn diagram of like, you know, pro-Palestine people and Thriller fans is like, I know I'm in there, but I don't know how many other people are in there. So I kind of knew that like it wasn't going to get much interest from the Thriller community, and I, you know, I also knew that I was taking the chance that the Palestine community would find it a bit strange to read a military thriller type of book. So yeah, I seem to have fallen right in between. I you know, it's good. I still think it's good, but you know, it would. I think for this to like take off, it would have had to like really transcended the genre, you know, and so on. But, yeah, well, maybe next time.
Thanks, Justin. Abby, I see your hand.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And Yasmin, I'd be interested as my co-author to hear a reflection on this, because we've had nibbles, but no bites. You know, we've had individual editors, producers, journalists kind of like check us out and say, wow, this would certainly be something that people would be interested in. And, you know, gone to the point of preliminary interviews and so on and so forth. But when it gets into their discussions with their producers or editors, suddenly it goes cold. And I think it's reflecting the kind of conversation that we are trying to provoke it. I mean, we could all talk probably about what we've been through to get publishers who, you know, will support our work, and, you know, distribution, and at every point there's a struggle. You know, at every point there's some back and forth commitment of, okay, if we're going to do this, there's going to be consequences. But it's interesting how they're, you know, it hasn't, the fundamental structure of the mainstream media, I don't think has yet to shift. Yasmin, I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I'll just pipe in. I mean, if we're thinking about here in Canada, well, let's recall that until now, CBC, you know, the main, you know, broadcasting corporation of this country, has a language policy where they say you can't use the word Palestine. So how, you know, how in that sort of context does it become possible to have the sort of conversation that we're having here today? I think that's a huge question, and it's a huge question for all Canadians. I also will just observe that, you know, this past spring and summer, with the events at Sheikh Jarrah, that there were a lot of journalists that were speaking out against one of the themes that was raised by Greg, which is this sort of both sidesism, that at best the media coverage was, you know, kind of trying to present two equal sides. And there were journalists saying this is really problematic. And, you know, they got barred from being able to do stories on CBC. So I think those are really real questions for all Canadians, not just, you know, people that are writing about Palestine, about what the media covers. And And I think it also, to kind of go back to some of the comments Abby was making about our own experience, I would say on other topics I write on, it's a lot easier to get media coverage on them than this one.
Thank you so much. I have a hand up from Peter and from Marcel. So Peter first, then Marcel.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I've written a book, as I've mentioned in the chat, but it's not yet published. So I can't answer your question directly about being covered in the press for the book. But I might just offer this. I got started with sort of activism on the campus with respect to Palestine in 1990. So I've been at it for about 30 years. And I can say that I've written numerous letters and op-eds. I've had one op-ed in the local newspaper here and about 4 letters published. I had nothing in the Global Mail, despite repeated things, no answers from the Global Mail, except on one occasion, I've just mentioned this briefly, I presented a paper at the what was then the Learned Societies in 1992 about the Global Mail's photographic coverage of victims in the First Intifada, Palestinian victims versus Jewish-Israeli victims. And there was quite clear difference in the way that those victims were represented. Basically, the Palestinian victims are not represented at all. But there's very humanized representation of the Jewish-Israeli victims, as they should have been. So I sent this to the Global Mail because it was all about the Global Mail. And I got this reply from William Thorsall, who was then editor-in-chief. He misspelled my name, which is standard. He said, "Dear Mr. Elgin, I respond to your letter of June 24th. You write from an admittedly impassioned position and confine your analysis of a newspaper's coverage of a complex event to its selection of wire photos. The outcome is, with respect, trivial. I do hope you will find the time to read the newspaper. Sincerely." Just thought I'd throw that in for your consideration.
Thank you very much. That's a very helpful reflection. Marcel.
So my question is so as you've just been saying, there hasn't been much of a shift with regards to media coverage, and perhaps this is more difficult to measure. It's less tangible. But have you noticed a shift perhaps in attitudes at the level of civil society with regards to Palestine in view of since the events of last summer? So that's my question. So beyond the media, has there been a shift since last summer?
Is there anyone else with a thought or a question to contribute to the discussion before I throw it back to the panelists? Yasmin's point took an idea right out of my mind because I had no idea CBC prohibited the word Palestine. But I've noticed that it used to be that the trigger for a lot of upset was when you use the term apartheid. I've noticed that in recent moments of the movement, simply saying the word Palestine marks you as someone who is not to be trusted in certain circles of the academy and certain circles of the media. But I did not know that it was explicit. I thought it was an implicit bias that was, the fact that it's explicit is, my mind's kind of shocked and I don't quite know what to do with that information. It's quite something.
Yeah, and I mean, and just to go to the question that was just asked about shifts in civil society, I mean, I think, you know, there are sometimes episodic shifts in civil society. So when you have, you know, something like Sheikh Jarrah, and it's on television and it's in the news and so on, you may get, you know, a kind of shift in opinion that happens depending on the kind of conversations people are having, or things that may be taking place outside of the media, like, for example, with teach-ins or discussions and so on. And I think But I think the larger trajectory is one that is positive, and I think it reflects on what Greg was saying, which is that really over the last decade and a half, the work around Palestine solidarity has become much more sustained, and I think there is a shift going on for that's larger, but it has not dislodged some of the places where power is held, like within the mainstream media and what people may be consuming on the media. But I think certainly within universities, I think some of the conversations that we're having are different.
So I think
Myself-
that, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to comment on or answer this question in another way, because during the last attack on Gaza in May, and also the events of Sheikh Jarrah in April, I noticed for the first time the large turnout of the public, despite sometimes the very short notice of organizing a demonstration or rally. Like, for example, here in Edmonton, for the car rally, we expected probably hundreds, and then it turned to be 10,000 people to go out and to the streets. You feel it in the turnout in the demonstration, which is really sending very strong message from the ground, and you notice lots of young people are joining to protest, as well as these links to be I would say strengthened with other solidarity groups such as Black Lives Matter, Idle No More, Indigenous. I feel it, I see it every day, even with neighbors stopping me to talk about what is going. So probably these are signs that tells us, yes, there is this pessimism in mainstream corporate media, but on the other hand, we have to look also that things are changing, and we feel it, and this gives us push that we are doing the right thing, and to continue doing what we are doing, to hopefully that sometime justice will be retained in Palestine.
Thank you so much. We're coming to the end of our time. I think there's a universal law of Zoom that 90 minutes is the maximum. But I think I'll give the panelists in reverse order, take a minute to pull together any last thoughts you have. So I'll start with Suzanne and go the other way. So Suzanne, 1 minute.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure being part of this panel and meeting everybody. And I hope to see you in our mutual work for Palestinian freedom. Thank you.
Greg.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to add one thought that I guess had neglected to mention, which is that for people who might feel that they're too much of an outsider to the issue, but nevertheless are drawn to it, I think keep in mind that for one thing, struggles against colonialism and imperialism and capitalism are matters in which everyone has some sort of a vested interest if they're concerned with the liberation of peoples, and yes, those we may have different degrees of stakes in that on issue X, Y, or Z, but there is good reason to be involved, even if you don't have like a personal, familial, or ethnic or cultural connection to the matter. And there's also, an endless kind of array of aspects of the issue that a person can tackle, either through concrete organizing work and or intellectual work. So, I'm not so much talking about, like, the title of this group is Writing Palestine, and I'm not so much writing Palestine per se in my work. I don't know whether I'm in a position to do that, as I am writing about writing on Palestine. And that kind of meta commentary and criticism of the discourse around this issue and many others is something that I think has really proliferated, you know, in the online sphere and in the classroom and in other spaces. So I think this is somewhere where we can carve out space beyond personal experience or familial links, is through you know, the level of kind of meta discursive criticism. There's, I think, room for everyone in these types of struggles. At least from where I sit, that's how it looks.
Thank you, Greg. Justin.
Wow, that was great. Yeah, I mean, I thought about what John Riddell said too. You know, the Canadian connection in terms of colonialism too, and you know, for me, and maybe a lot of people with like an immigrant background have this, where it's actually like studying Palestine for a while helped me understand what Canada is doing to Indigenous people and First Nations better, and like to understand it as a present, ongoing colonial project, not something that happened in the past, right? And it's like, you know, some of the things that Israel only aspires to, Canada has pulled off. You know, like Canada is in some ways like an unbelievably successful colonial project. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess writing, reading, these are all ways that we can communicate with each other and, you know, share experiences potentially in a way that, you know, you may not be able to go and see something in Palestine, but this is, you know, this can bring that to you. So, you know, thank you again for putting this together and for sharing this with us.
Thank you, Justin. Gaza.
I think I will leave you with the few lines of Sahb al-Berberi. She is the narrator of the second in this volume. She says, Palestine has enough room for everyone, regardless of their religion and sect. Giving back our rights is the shortest way to peace, but assassinating our leaders, bombing our homes, and using all kinds of modern weapons will not give you security and will not bring an end to the Palestinian cause. Neither you, not America, can do this. Not now, not in 1,000 years. Sahb al-Berberi, Light the Road over Freedom. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Gaza. Abby and Yasmin. I never know who to call first, so.
We're going in reverse order. So
Okay.
Yasmin, you go first.
Well, I think what was really interesting on this panel is that you have represented, you know, people that are Jewish, people that are Palestinian, and those that are neither. And I think it's really speaking to the fact that writing Palestine is a compelling topic, and it's compelling because it's really about a human rights struggle and an unfinished human rights struggle. So I think I would stress that, and I'd also say that we were all very open about our own positionality as we were having this discussion. But it's interesting, I think, going forward to think about where people are open about it and where they aren't open about it, and what that might be reflecting. So it's not to say that you know, you have to be from a particular group to write about a particular group, but you know, why is it some are kind of called on that and some aren't, or some feel like they need to say it and some don't. So I think those are questions that we might think about when we think about writing Palestine.
Thank you, Yasmin. Abby.
So yeah, I guess I mean, I'm really privileged. I feel really privileged and happy to have been part of this. And it's also really wonderful to share this with an audience that, thank you, Peter and John, for your comments that are taking some inspiration to keep writing Palestine. And I hope everyone feels that they have a voice. And, you know, sometimes the Palestinian struggle is referred to as our generation's Vietnam. And the Vietnam movement, I was very young during the Vietnam movement, but it shaped me. I was raised in Chicago. My brother was draft age. And I think there are ways in which Palestine is shaping a conversation now about liberation and humanity and civil rights. And so we all have something to say in that. And I was kind of thinking about intellect and emotion, because on the one hand, a lot of what we do, Yasmin and I have spent a lot of time checking, you know, all of us who write on this subject, you check every fact and footnote and piece of evidence. And I'm sure, you know, Justin, even in your fictional writing, and for those of us who do oral histories, I mean, we know that the critics are all lined up before the, you know, we used to say the ink hits the page, but now it's the computer, you know, page is gone published. But at the same time, this is not fundamentally or just reducible to an intellectual project. When you embark on writing the truth about Israel-Palestine and the entanglements, and, you know, Yasmin and I had been writing for many, many years before we started writing together about issues of race and identity and citizenship and multiculturalism. And this one was just sitting there, you know, in terms of mainstream political science, subject to all of those same traditional questions, but it was just seen as untouchable. And so there's an emotional component as well about just finding your voice and finding your words. So it's really a great tribute to the organizers of this panel and to the Society for Socialist Studies and Faculty for Palestine for making this space available. And it's certainly given me a sense of hope going forward that we can keep, as Edward Said says, you know, speaking truth to power.
Thank you so much to all the panelists. I want to reiterate the point I made when the discussion began. The work that is being done in writing these books is big and it's important. And just thank you for doing that work and keep doing it. I want to end by, and there we go. Zoom is so wild, eh? It's like this thing that we have been doing. Okay, and I want to invite everyone to the next in this series of seminars that is happening. I will put it up on the screen, I think successfully, which is Writing Social Transformation, November 25th, 6 p.m. Same idea with Eventbrite. And once again, thanks to Megan for putting together the publicity. That will be going out to your emails and all the different ways that we communicate these days shortly. So